Welcome into the Cricket Wireless Fantasy Football Faceoff. I'm Stephanie Theobald here with Dan Clasgens, and we're going to take a look at the NFC North as we move towards the second half of the season. Let's start with the number one team in the NFC North standings, which would be the Bears. But it's not their offense that deserves recognition, but their stellar defensive performance.
Yeah, that D is really lighting up the scoreboard, Steph. You look at what they've done now, 7 defensive touchdowns in just 8 games. That's sick. There's 8 teams in the league that are good defenses. Teams like the Lions, the Bengals, the Eagles, the Packers that were drafted on draft day that haven't even scored a single defensive touchdown. The Bears D is so good right now. They've doubled up 27 of the 32 teams in the league as far as fantasy points. You look at their 12 points a game, it's 5 points better than the second place Giants, and they've actually played one more game. So the Bears defense rewarding owners nicely. But, you know, the other player that I think's been not talked about enough is wide receiver Brandon Marshall. He continued his stellar season on Sunday, pulled in 9 catches, had the 122 yards and a touchdown. Marshall is on pace for career numbers across the board. Almost 1,600 yards receiving, 14 touchdowns, an amazing 118 catches. If he continues this pace, he will finish as fantasy football's top receiver. The only other guy that's even close right now is A.J. Green, who has 1 more touchdown, but less receptions and less yards than Marshall. So I like him. Jay Cutler hasn't worked out as well for him. He's still capable of big days. We saw 3 touchdowns on Sunday. Matt Forte is clearly the running back to have here, but Brandon Marshall and the Bears defense are where the fantasy MVPs have been for the team out of the Windy City.
Well, coming second in the standings, Dan, are the Green Bay Packers, coming off a 31-17 win over the Cardinals, despite being plagued by injuries. And now they're coming into a 4-game winning streak going into that bye week, giving multiple players time to heal.
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head there, Steph. That bye week's going to be huge for the Packers. Not going to help with Greg Jennings. He just finally had surgery. Looks like it's going to be a few more weeks before we can maybe see him back in the lineup. Jordy Nelson did come back right before the bye, and we thought the hamstring was an issue. It did fine the game, but now he hurt his ankle, so he's going to need time to heal. But the real questions to me rely around the backfield. I was one guy in particular that was high on Alex Green coming in the season. I know a lot of people were riding Sed Benson. Right now it's James Starks that got the surprising start in Week 9, continuing to make a fantasy nightmare for Packer owners of running backs here. I avoid the situation at all possible. I still think Green has some long-term value, but maybe Benson comes back. One guy that has no value right now is tight end Jermichael Finley. In fact, I don't even think I would carry him on a roster. He's one of the most disappointing players in fantasy football. Continued on Sunday, just 2 targets, 1 catch for 6 yards. He hasn't scored since Week 1. He played on just 50% of the team's snaps. He's no longer really a fantasy option.
Well, one team not letting injuries get in the way are the Detroit Lions with power players Mikel LaShore and Joik Bell, who delivered the Lions' best rushing attack in nearly a year on Sunday.
Yeah, it was a great day for both backs, and both backs have been great fantasy plays. I mean, LaShore gets all the headlines, and I think he's only going to continue to get better. Now, they're not going to play the Jacksonville Jaguars every Sunday, but that said, LaShore has proven to be a reliable running back too. Joik Bell, though, is just a few spots behind him in the running back rankings for the season, and as a player that not only has become a bye-week filler, but particularly if you're in a PPR league, this guy could option as a flex play in deeper formats on a weekly basis. Now, the passing game is what I'm interested to see what happens in the second half. I do expect both Matthew Stafford and Calvin Johnson to perform better than they did in the first half of the season. That's easy to say. The question is will they come close to what we saw in 2011? I'm not so sure that's going to happen this season, but I'd probably take my chances and buy low on both players moving into the second half.
Well, Dan, rounding out the NFC North standings are the Minnesota Vikings. Despite Peterson's incredible game, the Vikings still could not defeat the Seahawks on Sunday.
Yeah, the Vikings have really benefited from an easy first half slate, and it's a murderous stretch from here on out for them. So the opponents aren't going to be easy. The optimistic thing surrounding the team has to be Adrian Peterson, not just the stats he's putting up, but the way he's looking, Steph. I talked about it on our radio show. I've talked about it at length on the blog. Adrian Peterson, coming off a major surgery, is running with such force, and I really think he's if not the top 3, certainly a top 5 running back moving forward for the rest of this year. The passing game is a whole different story. Christian Ponder, who looked pretty good and like he could be a fantasy option there just a few weeks ago, he has lost himself. And along with that, a lot of the weapons of the passing game. Percy Harvin, he hurt himself, so we're going to see how that ankle does. I still think he's a good option. But Kyle Rudolph, a guy that I love to start the season, he did well. Ponder has no confidence in him right now. He's not getting the targets. Another goose egg turned out by the Vikings tight end on Sunday. So while I'm not ready to cut him, I'm starting to have a tough time endorsing putting him in the lineup.
You have been watching the Fantasy Football Faceoff with Dan Clasgens and Stephanie Theobald. Join us Sunday mornings along with James Adams for the Cricket Wireless Fantasy Football Game Day on Fox Sports 1360. And for more fantasy football news, you can always like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter @GetSportsInfo.